Hello, I'm Dick Fleming, a retired former civil servant with the European Union. I've been asked to talk today about quality in interpretation. So what is quality interpretation? My definition would be that it's interpretation that allows participants at a meeting to easily follow what everyone at that meeting is saying, irrespective of the language they're speaking. Ideally, everything would be going so smoothly that the participants would forget that they're even listening to interpretation. And actually, it's not good interpretation, it's bad interpretation that gets noticed by meeting delegates. They notice long pauses with nothing coming across. They notice gobbledygook, in other words, when interpreters are talking nonsense. They notice blatant contradictions between one sentence and the next, since normally speakers don't contradict themselves quite that quickly. They notice a strong foreign accent, particularly if it goes hand in hand with poor grammar or intonation. And they may notice inappropriate use of terminology. They'll also probably notice inappropriate or unprofessional behaviour, and even inappropriate dress code. Any meeting participant can soon tell whether an interpreter is at ease himself and whether he or she is easy to listen to. If you like, he can judge the packaging of the message, and the packaging is very important when you're listening to interpretation all day. However, it may not be quite so easy for the delegate to judge whether he's getting the right message, because he can't normally compare the original with the interpretation. However, if he's not getting the right message, it probably won't take all day for him to start suspecting that something is up, either because of incongruities in the interpretation, or the fact that participants always seem to be at cross purposes with one another and don't seem to understand each other's questions or answers. In short, even the most beautifully packaged and confident sounding interpretation will be unmasked as a fake way before the end of the meeting if the delegates aren't able to get their points across and understand one another. And they will be extremely annoyed, since they have no choice but to trust the interpretation, a service they rely on to follow the meeting, and they'll feel let down in no small way. They'll start to look grumpy, and they'll start to get grumpy. They'll complain about the interpretation, and they may even throw off their headphones in disgust. Not a pretty sight, and it probably won't end there. There will be consequences. Not that poor interpretation is a hanging offence, thank God for that, we've all had our bad moments, but if you're found wanting at a meeting, particularly on the private market, the chances are that you won't be employed by those people again, and word may get round that you're not to be trusted. This could ruin your career as an interpreter, as well as helping to give a bad name to the profession as a whole. So the moral of the tale is never take on any assignment that you aren't sure you can handle. For example, never agree to work from a language that you don't fully understand. Never accept an assignment on a subject that you find impossible to get to grips with. So, be careful and beware, for your own sake, but also for that of your fellow interpreters. But let's come back to our delegate and assume he has got quality interpretation in his meeting. What sort of feed then is he getting? Well, I'll be the delegate now and give my assessment of this quality interpretation. It's making sense to me, I can understand what my interpreter is saying, it's clear. Secondly, he or she is using acceptable and natural language. I'm not being put off by poor use of language, I'm not being distracted by strange use of language, and thus I can concentrate instead on the message. If the voice is pleasant, and the delivery is relaxed and confident, that makes it even easier for me to listen. And in fact, it's like listening to the radio. If the use of terminology is correct so much the better. But it doesn't have to be 100% correct. I am a delegate at a meeting, I am probably an expert in the subject, and if my interpreter expresses ideas clearly, I don't mind if the terminology used is not 100% correct, because I can read between the lines. Crucially, of course, I want the right message to come across. My message to come across to the other participants, and their message to come across correctly and faithfully to me. And finally, I want my interpreter to behave correctly, not to put his feet on the table or to make rude comments about the other delegates or about me, for that matter, either. Now, if all of this happens, if we get all these good quality characteristics there, we have quality interpretation. And it's the only type of interpretation worth having. Bad interpretation is no use to anyone at all, and it's often actually worse than no interpretation at all, and certainly a lot more expensive. Hence the need to ensure that anyone who works as an interpreter, for example with a large international organisation like the European Union, where I used to work, has to be capable of providing that quality interpretation. So I'm going to change my hat again and not be a delegate anymore, but become a member of a European Union test panel, checking the suitability of freelance interpreters to be employed by us. So how do we go about this? Well, we look for the quality features that I've just described as a delegate. At least one member of the test panel will listen only to the candidate's interpretation in order to check that it makes sense. If it doesn't, the candidate has failed. If it does, the rest of the panel will then look at how faithful the message was to the original, because most of the panel, unlike the average delegate, will have listened both to the original speech and to the interpretation. If there are some major mistakes, the candidate will be marked down and will probably fail, but of course this will depend on how serious the mistakes are and also how difficult the original speech was. The panel will then consider the candidate's use of language. Was it natural, authentic? Also, what about his or her delivery? And they probably won't look at the use of terminology, because most speeches given at tests are not technical in nature. Finally, they'll look to see whether the candidate applied the sort of skills, techniques and coping tactics that he would normally have learnt at an interpreting school. The end product doesn't have to be perfect. Interpretation rarely is. But the message has to be conveyed clearly and faithfully in a form which would allow a delegate to understand pretty well what someone else was saying in a meeting, and to understand in reasonable comfort without having to work hard to decipher what the interpreter's message is. So there you have it. I've tried to show what distinguishes quality interpretation from the rest, and also how test panels look for it. Above all, I hope I've made it clear that quality interpretation is the only interpretation worth having. Thank you.